Warmly welcome to Crime and Tension Techniques for Fantasy Writers, learning from bestsellers of fantasy, Harry Potter, Mistborn, Game of Thrones, Fourth Wing, and more. This is a presentation in 4 parts. So this is going to be the first part, world building. The next 3 parts is going to be different ways of plotting, mystery, heists, or thrillers. The first question that we need to ask ourselves going into this whole material is why. Why combine crime and fantasy? Why not just enjoy them as separate genres? So the answer to this question has to be that somehow they're more than the sum of their parts. So what makes them more than the sum of their parts, and what can they add to each other? First up, what crime can add to fantasy. Instead of a slow, info-dumpy world where nothing happens for hundreds of pages, I'm sure at some point you have read these kinds of fantasy stories where the author just swims around in world building and nothing happens. But elements of crime can add narrative drive and focus, movement, urgency, tension, excitement, and energy, surprises and reveals. It can create interest in the world building, add a sense of plot cohesion and the meaningfulness of a well-planned story. And also, fantasy can add a lot to crime. And it might sound like I don't like crime stories when I describe them this way, but I totally do. But sometimes they can be very small scope. There's just, a few persons involved, so it feels kind of small and narrow, claustrophobic. It can feel very formulaic and forgettable in the way that, if you've seen a few of these crime stories, at some point it's going to be very forgettable, like they feel like just mashups of the same plot. And also if the setting isn't very flavorful or isn't giving enough, it can just feel like it just happens in this like bland world and it could totally happen anywhere. So fantasy can add a lot to crime as well. It can really add this feeling of color and depth. It can give stronger and more unique visuals. It can add a feeling of wonder or awe, of terror and horror. It can use unique legal situations that only certain world building can give. It can add a wider scope, like a world scope, instead of just with a few people. Also the place specificity and connectedness, and a feeling of something ancient, often with layers of history. So fantasy settings can really make also crime plots and crime techniques shine. And we have the concept of commercial genre, also called marketing genre, and content genre. Commercial or marketing genre would be where you'd go in the bookstore, which shelf to find a fantasy novel, for instance. So you'd just go to the fantasy shelf. The content genre is something else. It's not for how to put the right kind of book in the hands of a reader. It's more about creating a certain kind of plot. So it's for the writer, not for the reader. And fantasy is not a content genre. So a fantasy setting can have different kinds of plot. It can have an action plot, it can have a romance or a crime story. Since fantasy is not a content genre, it needs to be filled with a plot. And as fantasy has some of the most advanced world building, and crime has some of the most advanced plotting, together they can make really big worlds with big stories. So it's really like a match made in heaven. And If you're still not convinced, these are just a few fantasy stories that uses crime techniques. We have the Harry Potter series, Fourth Wing, Mistborn, Historic Materials by Philip Pullman, Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas, Name of the Wind, The Lies of Locke Lamora, House Moving Castle, The Dresden Files, Six of Crows, and the Bartimaeus series. So there's a lot of fantasy that uses techniques from the crime genre. So this is going to be the first part about world-building criminality. And we're going to go into the foundation of building crime into fantasy. So how to build a world that comments how to build a world that comments on crime in profound and interesting ways, and craft stories that use these opportunities to explore crime as a societal phenomenon. So, first off, crime is often taken for granted. And this is especially the case if you live in a place that's, not in war and is a peaceful place and has a normal functioning society. So using crime is something that we even children have a concept of, and we kind of just throw it around like this once a plot that I just created here, like once a cat, once a dog, together they solve crime. But rather than going with this slapdash definition of crime, many of the most interesting fantasy stories go deeper. And to understand how, we're going to ask the question, what is criminality? So criminality, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is illegal activities or behavior, or the fact of being illegal. So there is this legal and illegal. One has the stamp of approval and one has the stamp of disapproval. And who is putting this stamp of approval? This is the process called criminalization. So that's making something illegal and punishable by law. In criminology, so this is the process of which behaviors and individuals are transformed into crime and criminals. And whether they're elected by the people or not, and whether it's good for the people at large or not, criminalization is done by people in power. And what's being punished? So I have written out 2 circles here. The blue one is actions that cause harm. This is what's called mala in se in criminology, so which means something that's bad in itself. So murder, assault, and theft is like these typical examples of actions that usually is punished because they cause harm to other people. And the other circle is mala prohibitas, which is illegal actions, things that are prohibited. And in a good society, harmful actions are punished, and this creates a sense of safety for the individual. So if my neighbor would be murdered and I saw it happen, I would just call the police and they would take care of it, and I wouldn't have to worry. It would be out of my hands. So it creates this feeling that we can rely upon somebody to do this job. So in this case, illegal actions and actions that cause harm are very much the same, as you can see with my circles. And also, a good society applies this concept, presumption of innocence. So if you're unsure of someone's guilt, it's better to acquit than convict, which means that some people where there's we're not really sure, there's not enough proof that they really committed this crime, will go free. So in my circles, the things that are punished is a little bit smaller than the things that cause harm, because we also have the presumption of innocence. So some people go free. So if these things aren't aligned as it is in our society, or mostly in our society, there are different ways to create something different and create a different kind of society. And one of them is by using over-criminalization. And that means to have too much punishment, so you over-criminalizes something. So an authoritarian society would punish too harshly and also use punishment to oppress people. And this is common in a dystopian setting. And what might come to mind for a lot of people will be maybe the Hunger Games or 1984. But also a lot of fantasy has over-criminalization, and we're going to look at a few examples. So Mistborn is one of our examples. There we have the Steel Ministry. So on the picture you see inquisitors, which are like scary looking and physically strong creatures. Then it forces the laws for the all-powerful Lord Ruler. So the Lord Ruler really has all power, and he uses these people to oppress the whole population. And under here there's just this list of like whenever there's a divorce, a wedding, a land purchase, inheritance, blah blah blah, if it's not witnessed by the Steel Ministry, it might as well not have happened or not have been written. So they really have a hand in everything that's going on in the society. In historic materials, we have the magisterium, which operates more or less like the Vatican during the Crusades, and the Spanish Inquisition all roll into one. It controls all scholarly inquiry, punishes heresy without mercy, and kidnaps and tortures children with impunity. So this is really an over-criminalization, a society that uses punishment to oppress. And also interestingly, in this prequel called The Book of Dust, the magisterium has another even more chilling weapon, the League of St. Alexander, which are children who they wear badges, and they are encouraged to inform any adults they catch doing anything sinful or heretical, according to the magisterium. So an example here is that at Malcolm, the protagonist's school, the headmaster tries to forbid the pupils just from wearing the badges on school property. And the students, who are drunk with power, promptly inform on him, and he's taken into the magisterium's custody, and he's just never heard from again. So here you can see, the normal school hierarchy just upended by the League of St. Alexander, so the magisterium's secret weapon here. In Harry Potter, we have another school example, the Inquisitorial Squad. And maybe you can already see that there's an inquisitional word going on in a lot of these examples, and I will come back to that. But the Inquisitorial Squad is handpicked by High Inquisitor Dolores Umbridge in book number 5 in the series. And their job is to catch wrongdoers, but they spend a lot of more time just taking house points away from Gryffindors and Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs. So they're really also using their extra authority to do whatever they want. So in two of these examples, we see a school environment, which is a very effective place to show growing injustice in a fictional world. You have clear power structures, which can be changed or upended when this authoritarian society grows or changes. And there's this universal relatability, so everybody understand what's normal and not, and then it's really easy to show when something isn't normal anymore. It's also near to everyday life and emotionally close, or it's easy to make it emotionally close to the protagonist if it's someone who's still in school. So it's easier than just having this distant scope at the top of the society. And also, authoritarian regimes change school curriculums according to their propaganda. So you really get a chill if you're reading school books from Nazi Germany. And schools are not the only places who can perform similar functions. You can also have workplaces and sport clubs and other organizations do this. And here we have a very well-known example of a growing authoritarian society, starting with these rules in school, and then the rules are, or similar kinds of rules are put into the whole society. Of course, then ministered by Dolores Umbridge. And the Spanish Inquisition might have come to mind with all these inquisitors, inquisitorial squads, and so on. And this is one of the most horrifying examples of power abuse in our history. And a lot of fantasy is looking back on history for examples. And so this is something that continues to inspire, or quote unquote inspire, fantasy authors when they want to showcase what unjust criminalization can do to a society and its individuals. And Margaret Atwood, when asked about, how do you get all these wicked ideas from your Handmaid's Tale story? And she said, I found it in history, I didn't make them up. So it's really a good source if you're a fantasy author and want to create this feeling of authenticity, to look for examples in history. But then, of course, you also have to world build and make it work in your own world. And something that we also can note, in an authoritarian society, breaking the law can become a moral imperative. So sometimes breaking the law is the right thing to do. You need to do it for things to get better. So with this example of Harry Potter. And now we're going to move to the other extreme, under criminalization. This is when the circle of legal actions is smaller than actions that cause harm. And in these settings, usually ordinary people have to take the law into their own hands. This is common in pre-industrial, so for instance, medieval-like fantasy settings, or the post-apocalyptic settings. So the illegal actions might be, for instance, as you see in this circle, like some actions are illegal of the actions that cause harm. So murdering a stranger might be illegal, but not your wife or murdering a beggar. Another way to organize society might be that illegal actions actually has no overlap at all with actions that cause harm. So insulting the king would be such an example. So it's not protecting common people at all. It's solely protecting the interests of those in power. And especially if we had a post-apocalyptic setting, you might have no established laws whatsoever. They might be just, people might try to create justice on the spot. And with weak laws and weak legal protection for the individual, moral issues are really raised and tension spikes in moment where laws, or quote unquote laws, are applied or misapplied, and or punishment is carried out. So a few examples of this would be in Game of Thrones in the first season, Ned Stark, he's going to be appointed by the previous king, who is just died, to be the legal protector of Joffrey, the coming king who's still a minor. And he hands this paper over to Cersei, Joffrey's mother, and she says, and I kind of get a chill just from going to this point, because I just feel like this is just a brilliant point of the story. But she says, "Is this meant to be your shield, Lord Stark?" A piece of paper, and then she just rips it. And what happens in the room is that, everybody tenses, like, what's going to happen now? And so since the legal protection in this society is so low, people in power can easily try to grab more power in the moment, like she is doing here. In Rings of Power, we have another example of deciding the question of who's going to rule. So there's this trial by sea. So the ruler is just thrown into water, and if she's the right ruler, the sea god will save her. So the outcome is then decided by this Valar of the Water. Reminds one maybe a little bit of the witch trials, where people are thrown into water. We have the trial by combat, used to great effect in Game of Thrones. Here is the Mountain and the Viper fighting over the fate of Tyrion Lannister. So the outcome here is decided by people representing the accused fighting to death. So, to us watchers of the 21st centuries, this might feel like a very weird way to try to carry out justice. And the Löwenskiold Ring, which is more it's more a magical realism book than a pure fantasy, but it has a lot of the folklore and the kind of sources that fantasy also draws upon, and it has very interesting parallels with The Lord of the Rings. So in this book, which I also recommend a lot, by Swedish author Samuel Lagerlöf, it's available for free, by the way, Gutenberg Project. So the fate of 3 men accused of murder is just decided by throwing dice. So if they get a good score here, God is protecting them. And it's also this very tense moment that, since this is a book that follows generation after generation who are affected by what's happening to this ring, what happens to these people is going to affect people in generations to come. So it's really like a moment where a lot's at stake. And a question we can ask ourselves as writers is, who decides the legal outcome in this world and situation? And I hope you see from my example that this is a great opportunity to show your specific world building, pose moral questions, build moments of high tension, and impact the characters and plot greatly all at the same time. So here are a few possibilities. It can be evidence or pleas, used in a just way or an unjust way. It can be fate or the gods, And how will they show their will? The ruler can rule by law, but it can also be on a whim, like when Joffrey kills Ned Stark, which is just made up on the spot because he wants it. It can be the will or the perceived will of the people. It can be war or a violent contest, for instance, trial by combat. Characters who just seize the opportunity to grab power, or no one knows. If there are no laws for the situation, they just have to be created there and then. So the next question is, what's just? And in the eyes of the reader and in the eyes of the characters. And these might be the same thing, but they might also be a bit different. And the question is, real justice carried out? And a way to really ramp up the tension would be to have an unjust conviction, because it just creates a strong desire in the reader for someone, maybe your protagonist, to carry out justice and keep the story going. And my little tip here is, don't waste an opportunity to make things really hard for your character. To sum up some of the things that we have talked about, both over and under criminalization can force your protagonist to act and make hard choices instead of relying on others. And this creates interesting situations and stories. And in both over and under criminalization, what usually happens is that powerful people or people who want to become powerful misuse their power. So there will be a society where there's more power than justice. And a very typical movement in a story would be to have a society where people in power misuse their power, going into finding justice. So this can look like you have somebody who's leading with fear, who's gaining power by actions that make people fear them. And you might have an emerging leader who leads with integrity and makes people come together because they inspire others through their moral uprightness. And this is a kind of story that we as readers or watchers might need to hear again and again in different versions, in different settings, because, and maybe it's even more important than ever in our society, where it's so different to change things, and where it's so hard to create change, to really be reminded that change is actually possible. And then there's a lot of stories also that would reject the hero versus villain binary. So instead, they will show, heroic people thinking they're the hero of the story, but they can misunderstand the role they have themselves, the role they play out in their society, or they just don't see their own weaknesses or bad sides, which is also a story that we need to hear, I think. So this might be the first season of Game of Thrones, where Ned Stark is definitely the moral upright character, but his heroism and his uprightness just isn't enough in this society. And Arcane, League of Legends, the TV series, is also a very interesting example, because most stories, they either have a sympathy with the people who are on the side of the law, or a sympathy for people who are breaking the law. And Arcane shows just how criminal laws and criminality just shapes individuals on both sides of the law, and just sympathizes with everyone, and really just show the variety of how people are influenced in different ways by criminalization. Also highly recommended. So overall, if you use criminalization in your story in a thoughtful way, you can create a world ripe with thematic possibilities. And these are just some of these possibilities. You can show empathy and humanization of offenders, both of those who commit certain actions out of necessity, like stealing a bread to support their family, or for moral reason to overthrow an evil ruler, say. You can have social critique of existing laws, of who them protect and why they're established, and really highlight the impact these rules have on normal people, or people in general. And one of these specific things would be recognizing signs of authoritarian societies, which is something that I think we all need to have an awareness of. And then there's also just exploring situations that has less social security than we have, just to explore, like, how would it be to live in this situation and this situation. So how to deal in your reality where every man for himself would apply. And in these situations, where's the line for what's morally right in the fight for justice or the fight for retribution? So both under and over criminalization has a lot of interesting possibilities. But even in a quite good society where these people align more or less, where you have people on the side of the law, you can do interesting things. So, for instance, if you have somebody solving crime, the hero might be firmly on the side of the law for a book or two. But if you world build just a few laws that, for instance, protect the powerful, and the hero maybe needs to cross some kind of law, you can create new problems that keep a series entertaining and interesting. And you can also show new sides of the world to the reader as the story goes on. So now we move on to a part where we go more into how to apply these things. And when you want to create a story, there can be different places where you start. It can start with the world building, and this is where I am starting. But you don't need to start with world building if that isn't where you want to get your idea from. You can also start with a plot, like, okay, I want to create a heist story in a fantasy world. Well, if you want to create a heist, then you might want to world build over criminalization, because that's the typical kind of fantasy world where you can, do a mega heist. Or you can start with the protagonist and their struggles, and then create a world that enable this particular story. And one of the things that makes me really like this way of doing it is because okay, so there is this concept of thin and thick descriptions in sociology and criminology. So a thin description would be something like, she killed him. So it's very little information in a thin description. But once you add some context, it becomes a thicker description. Like, he broke into the house and she killed him in self-defense. And now we have added so much context to this little fact that the sympathy starts to change. And the cool thing with the fantasy can do, and other speculative genres, is that you can create a whole world, so like a mega context around a specific situation, if you like. So this is like the ultimate thick description. And murder is a very good example of this, because in a peaceful, developed world, we wouldn't approve of murder, but fantasy stories are full of assassins. A lot of the times there are protagonists, and then you really use, you can create a whole context around why an assassin needs to kill to survive or for other reasons. So you can have a lot of fun with this. And when world building criminality, one thing that you might want to do is just to draw the circles. Malinsea is the circle that doesn't really change, because the actions that cause harm and the things that are bad in itself, murder, assault, theft, will be more or less the same. But the mala prohibitas or prohibita might be very different due to what kind of setting we have. So draw your green circle and brainstorm who has power or who loses and gains power throughout the story, and what laws exist or are created to benefit these rulers. If you have rulers, that is. Do your world have a tendency towards or a movement towards under or over criminalization? Where is the overlap, if any, with the Mala Inste circle? And how do rulers motivate the laws? Because, there has to be reasons that people accept for laws to be there, or the use of power is just so extreme that people have to accept it. And making people follow them, like including law enforcement, or an inquisitor if you're Brandon Sanderson. And here, I would say in an early point of the story, watch out for this. Beware of the plot holes that the quote-unquote oppressed mages trope can create. So a lot of stories has, magic people, they have to hide and not show that they have power. But powerful people will not, at least if they know anything about it, they will not refrain from possible means of using power, which could be magic, or it could be like control over supernatural creatures like monsters. So do brainstorm how magic or other supernatural elements is used by your law enforcement or oppressors, depending on how you see your world, and criminals or resistance on the other side. And by working on this early on, you will get a much more logical world, and also by doing it, you get a lot of intrinsic ways to show your magic in cool situations that really matters to the plot. And the next questions is about your protagonist. So how does criminality relate to the protagonist's backstory is a nice first question. What they encounter during the story, like is any crime committed that harms them? What's their moral integrity? And based on this, and based on your world, do they work with or against the law, and why? So by working with these questions, you will get both your protagonist and antagonist, because what will they do, and also who will hinder them, like what kind of laws will stand in their ways, or will they work with or against, and who are the people who are representing these laws. And then we come to the question that goes into my next 3 parts of the presentation. How will you build an exciting plot around it? And once you have determined how your world's criminality is going to work, the next step is to use it in the plotting. And different plot archetypes would involve protagonist who is working for or against the law. So, as a rule of thumb, on the side who wants to restore law and order, we have the typical murder mystery. The protagonist would work with the police, collaborate with the police, or solve magical or supernatural cases the police cannot handle themselves. And then if we're able to read it, I have drawn a line with the law, and right in the middle we have the thriller. It can involve one side or both, or move in between law, the side of the law, or a side against the law. And the typical heist story will typically be on the side of the lawbreaker, because you need to have, a place that's really that's hard to get into, that has a lot of systems, and to really have these mega these mega structures, it's usually on the side of the laws, like the ones who make these structures. So the protagonist is usually part of a group of criminals or rebels who might be stealing for personal gain. But also in fantasy, you have another option, which is to overcome evil forces, like both Mistborn and Harry Potter. This is the way they use their heists. So this is to escape or overturn law and order. So a few clear-cut examples, so you see what I mean here. The classic murder mystery would be, for instance, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. And Twin Peaks, the TV series. And a clear-cut example of a heist would be Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, or Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. And last but certainly not least, even more often than these clear-cut examples that I show you, fantasy stories employ techniques from these different plot archetypes, such as a plot twist in a story that's not primarily a mystery, or insert a heist as a part of a bigger plot. So they're using techniques from the crime genre as a plotting toolbox. And this is something that I'm very interested in, how fantasy stories are doing, and we will look more into that in the next part of the series. So just to end, if you're interested in learning more about criminology, I used this book in my research, Criminology, A Very Short Introduction by Tim Newburn.